Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this special episode. We're glad to be back. Last week we just posted our Oxford documentary and encourage people to check that out on YouTube. But we're back to podcast format now. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I've written a number of things. I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Anyway, enough about me. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, philosophy at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a few other places.
All right, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I've got my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries, esquareinch.org. And I will be leading a historical tour in Ireland this summer. If you're interested in that, check out the website.
Well, we're pleased to have a return guest, Brad Littlejohn. Great to see you, Brad. Could you introduce yourself, just kind of fill people in on what you do, who you are, who maybe just aren't familiar with you?
Yep, sure. Yep, so some listeners may be familiar with my former affiliation. I was the founder and president of the Davenant Institute for a little over a decade. For the last year, I've transitioned into Ethics and Public Policy Center, where I was a part-time fellow. Now I'm full-time doing research and writing and public policy work and coalition organizing and all sorts of fun stuff up here. Not quite inside the Beltway. I live I live a little ways outside the Beltway, and I go in and yeah.
So you live where sane people live, and then you have to like dip into the insanity.
Paddle around the swamp for a couple days a week. So yeah,
right. Great. Well, super. You've got a new book coming out with B&H Publishing, and we'd love to talk with you about that. Hey, there it is. Call to Freedom. Great title and a great theme, and some really great endorsements, people like Oliver O'Donovan and so forth. Can you tell us a little bit about the book? Can you give us maybe a quick summary before we dive into some of the things you really would like to get into?
Yeah, so the kind of starting premise of the book is something I noticed years and years ago, which is that there's something of a disconnect in the way that Christians think or talk about freedom. On the one hand, we have in the New Testament this language of freedom coming up a lot, especially in the letters of Paul. I quote Galatians a fair bit in the book, and we understand when we talk about freedom in that kind of theological context, we recognize that it's about freedom from sin, freedom to follow Christ. Paul says it's a freedom that is found in becoming bondservants of Christ. So it's this kind of paradoxically freedom that is found in self-renunciation and service, freedom that's found in following only one way. And yet, the rest of the time, but the vast majority of the time, we use freedom in this kind of casual, worldly sense of being left alone, do our own thing, do whatever I feel like doing, maximize my options, keep my options open, avoid commitments. And this is the kind of modern way of thinking about freedom. And sometimes this, I think it's problematic enough already that we kind of operate as these sort of two parallel tracks. It's even more problematic, I think, when the worldly way of thinking about freedom seeps into our theology. And so we think of, many churches, any attempt to preach on biblical morality or to practice church discipline runs into charges of, oh, you're just being legalistic. This is a Christian liberty issue. Who are you, pastor, to tell me what to do? Yeah. And of course, right. Spiritual abuse is a real thing, but sure. Modern Christians don't know how to distinguish between actual godly church discipline and spiritual abuse, because to them, any imposition on their freedom of choice, freedom of action, is seen as legalism. Right. So what I try to do in the book is, first of all, really recover and dig into what is that kind of core theological sense of freedom, what I call spiritual freedom. And I use Luther's great text on the freedom of a Christian a lot. And then build from there, kind of expand outward to start connecting the dots to the way we use freedom in other contexts. And so I talk about moral freedom, which is really what comes through sanctification. So distinguishing the freedom of justification, the freedom of sanctification, moral freedom, where we learn to discipline our desires and become capable of self-government. As we become capable of self-government through moral freedom, we are then equipped for political freedom, and societies made up of spiritually and morally free people are much more able to practice political freedom, where the government doesn't have to interfere in everything because their people have enough of an internal moral compass. But I talk about how that idea of political freedom as limited government because you have a self-governing citizenry, that idea has sort of been increasingly lost, with the idea of political freedom is, again, just sort of the multiplication of rights. So chapter 1 of the book is kind of like a basic conceptual roadmap. Chapter 2, 3, and 4 is spiritual freedom, moral freedom, political freedom. And then chapters 5, 6, and 7, I think, kind of give case studies of how the intersection of these different freedoms in the domain of technology, in the domain of the market, and in the domain of church and state issues.
Well, that's great. That's a great summary. And you know what? Are you familiar with Orlando Patterson? He wrote a book called Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. It won the National Book Award back in 1992. So it's a little old. Anyway,
I don't even think I've heard of it.
yeah, but your treatment actually reminded me.
I was only 5 at the time.
Your treatment actually reminded me a little bit about his approach. Now, Patterson's interesting because he's a Jamaican, so obviously a descendant of slaves, and he began his treatment with this assumption that somehow slavery was a uniquely Western problem. Then he actually did honest research and discovered, no, this is like the normal state of affairs in the world, and that the West is where freedom comes from. This freedom is where, the West is where freedom is fully explored and developed in various ways. And he has actually an entire section on the Apostle Paul and spiritual freedom, which is pretty impressive considering he's a Harvard guy. But anyway, I don't know if he's still around, but your book, as I noted, reminded me of that, and it's really a marvelous treatment. And I wanted to maybe give you a kind of an entry into the subject by maybe visiting something you've done in the book, and that is you have a subsection in the first chapter, mapping freedom in 3 dimensions. Mm-hmm. I think that would be helpful. So can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah. So there's lots of 3s in the book, right? There's these 3 dimensions in the beginning, then there's 3 types of freedom, chapters 2 through 4, and then 3 case studies, 5 through 7. So I studied with Peter Leithart for several years, and he made me think of everything in Trinitarian terms now. So,
it's amazing how well that works,
Yeah. So there's 3 different kind of poles that we can think about freedom, different ideas of freedom in relation to these different poles. So one is probably the most familiar to people, might be the distinction of negative and positive liberty, which is sometimes freedom from and freedom for. This comes from a lecture by Isaiah Berlin in 1958, 2 Concepts of Liberty. And essentially negative liberty, negative freedom is what we tend to talk about most in the modern West, which is just this kind of like freedom to be left alone and the sort of freedom of non-interference. But clearly that's not enough, because as human beings, our freedom is for rational action, which is to say it's always to be exercised with a purpose. And this is why an insane person is not really capable of exercising freedom. In fact, they may need to be externally constrained, because if they're not externally constrained, they have no directionality to their action. They don't have any positive liberty because they can't pursue any goal. And so this kind of goal-oriented exercise of freedom actually requires constraint, and in fact maybe can sometimes flourish within extreme constraints. So I talk about how I remember one thing was striking me a few years ago. I was watching the documentary about this guy who's a rock climber. What's it called? It's called freestyle climbing or something. And it's basically, climbing up rock faces with nothing, right? No harness or anything, just your hands and feet. And talked about how incredibly free he felt on the rock face. And of course, and it's weird, because like
Right.
I've done just enough, like like the the gym rock, climbing wall thing to know it doesn't have to be remotely free. It's like you're in a situation where it's like one wrong move and you're dead, right?
Right.
There's like you are.
I thought you
Go ahead.
said before that madmen couldn't be free.
Yes, perhaps, but people. Another example is like a musician who is operating within very, very strict constraints that the physical that the instrument imposes upon them, that the demands of the piece impose, but within those constraints, because they guide you towards your goal, they're free to achieve this level of excellence. And so we experience this kind of freedom as human beings within constraints, where we're able to be and do what we truly want to be or do, right? That's the positive versus negative. I'll be more concise than the other two. So probably sort of related to that, one is a distinction of inward versus outward liberty, where outward liberty is the bodily realm. I mean, this is the realm where other people can constrain your freedom. But the inner realm is the freedom of the mind and the will and the emotions, where you are, in some sense, always free to decide how to respond to what happens to you. However constrained you may be externally, it's always up to you to decide what to do with that. And so Paul and Silas in the Philippian jail are still free, because to them those bars don't matter relative to the fact that they are still in the presence of God and still know that they're doing God's will. Alexander Solzhenitsyn kind of talks about a similar idea of inner freedom. And then you have and one thing I say there is basically, although inner freedom yearns to express itself in outward freedom, inner freedom can exist without outward freedom, whereas outward freedom cannot actually exist at all without inward freedom, right? Without a free mind and will. So, and that's where that spiritual liberty becomes so important that I develop. Then there's a distinction between, and this is perhaps I think the most, I don't want to say original to me, but this is in my work what I really have focused on, because I found it to be often absent in so many contemporary discussions, is the distinction between individual and corporate liberty, or we could call it institutional liberty, which is that we tend to think freedom is just a property of an individual, but groups have freedom too. And we see this in our language. We talk about Ukraine fighting for its freedom. And most people who said that didn't really mean, except for maybe a few hyper liberals, they didn't really mean the individuals within Ukraine are fighting for the maximalization of their individual liberty. No, we understood that Ukraine as a nation had this kind of collective identity and was defending its national freedom. And in fact, even when we think about something like religious liberty, we usually have in mind the kind of corporate liberty. Within COVID, the issue was churches as communities not having freedom to worship. So it turns out some of the most important freedoms we value are actually the freedoms that we have in and through communities. And those at some level require us to renounce a degree of individual freedom. So the act of corporate worship means you have to get out of bed on Sunday morning. You have to show up at a certain time and place. You can't just sing whatever song comes into your head. You have to sing the song that the music leader has chosen. But you don't really think of that as, all right, I'm giving up my individual freedom in order to have this thing, right? You just actually experience it as an expansion of your freedom, because you're able to do things that you wouldn't be able to do on your own.
Yeah, that's really helpful and a good way to lay it out. I think, you brought out some things that at one level I think are just should be common sense, but aren't. One of those having to do with moral freedom and the necessity for moral freedom to exist before political freedom can be enjoyed. And I think for many people, they don't have an ability to think in those terms because they're anthropology is fuzzy. For a lot of folks, that freedom is doing what you feel like. And if I feel like doing something, then the being able to do it, that's freedom. But classically understood, biblically understood, that's not necessarily the case. You might be actually demonstrating your slavery to base passions or things that are really harmful to you in the long run and stuff like that.
Yeah. And of course, what people will say is, okay, you should be free to do what you want as long as you don't harm anybody else. Like everyone's sort of adds that qualifier. And the problem is that then people are just kind of ridiculously selective when it comes to what counts as harming someone else. They will turn, actually, one of the things I've been working on recently is a Supreme Court case on blocking access to pornography for kids. And this is a classic area where people say, adults should be. I mean, and the issue in this law is just like well, it's an imposition on adults' freedom for them even to have to verify their ages to access this material. It's no question of whether adults can access it. It's just whether they have a speed bump, right? But people will say, pornography, I should be free to do this because it doesn't harm anyone, right? Which is like a super blinkered idea of what counts as harm. I mean, usually the pornographers or the performers are being harmed in some significant way. And any relation, your spouse is being harmed, your children are, you and you yourself are being harmed. But if you're fine committing self-harm, fine. But think about all the other people that are actually being harmed by this. But then what you'll find is, again, it's so arbitrary what counts as harm because people will say, well, if somebody's not willing to bake a cake for a gay couple, that's not a freedom they should have because that is deeply harmful to the psychological well-being of the couple in question. Even though they could just go down the street and find another, they can still get the cake. Right? There's no question of whether they can get the cake. It's just a question of whether they have to suffer any psychological harm. So we have this very open-ended freedom that is then highly selectively qualified with this harm principle.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sure you all heard the sermon yesterday delivered to the president.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Yes. And it was principally about this issue in particular around, especially trans kids and quote unquote gay children who now are being harmed because of the new administration's policies. And this, of course, coming through what supposedly is a church. And it's interesting because what you do have here is this sense of anthropology that has very much baptized our fallen nature and made that very much what our identity is as a dignified human creature, right? And so they set that up as what having the dignity as being a human made in God's image. And so freedom takes on a very different coloring in theologies like that, because what they end up doing is creating what I would call a kind of a perversion of the genuine article, where the freedom is for them to truthfully be able to enact that fallen creatureliness as though it is the dignified human image bearer of God. And so they're almost mimicking what Christianity has on offer, where Christianity is saying something far more profound and fundamental, that freedom in the Christian, in the full sense of the word, is truthful enactment of our creatureliness and being an image bearer of God. But what comes with it, though, is an antecedent created order that is something that is, I think, the big rub with both distorted theologies, but also a culture that has rejected the created order. So I think that's where our big tension, we always have this tendency to look legalistic or as though we're imposing something on someone that they can't get a hold of because somehow they think it downplays it puts a law on their createdness in their distorted way of looking at it.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, another dimension on that is it ignores the potential of societal harm.
Right.
By focusing so much on the individual, it ignores the larger impact on the society.
Right.
So when you're looking at your various dimensions and you talk about, in historical terms, I would think of the Magna Carta, the liberties of the English Church, or these various social units that, or society as a whole, that are also elements of liberty, of freedom.
Yep.
We have to consider harm to them as well.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to argue that pornography performs an actual social good.
Yeah.
And you can
I mean,
make a very strong argument that it performs social harm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important corporate liberty to guard, and I'm still looking at the right term. Probably you say corporate liberty, and people think, you're talking about like the Citizens United case or something like the free speech of corporations. But yeah, I'll just use the term here. So the most important corporate liberty is that of the family as a social unit to have the particular freedoms that are proper to it as an institution. And I think that is what is being so demolished by these radically individual notions of freedom. Where, I mean, let's just start with the fact that the trans kid who goes through with the surgeries, the treatments, whatever, is permanently sterile. And so what you're taking out is the possibility of grandchildren there, which doesn't seem like that big a deal to so many people because, well, for two reasons. One is they're like, well, we can always technologically solve that, and we can just create babies in test tubes, essentially, through IVF and these other means. But we even if we conceded that, we'd say, yeah, but those babies as children are not going to have a healthy childhood environment, growing up without ordinary biological parents, male and female. But the other thing is, so many normal heterosexual people are choosing not to have children at all, and so they don't. And so, even to make that argument, well, look, these trans kids aren't going to be able to have children. Like, well, big deal. I gave them that a long time ago in the name of freedom. And I was reading this article. I think it was a New York Times article that about all these boomers that are coming to terms with the fact that they're never going to be grandparents. They're never going to have the freedom to enjoy that once just basic, human experience of being grandparents, because their children have decided that they'd rather not have kids. And so many of these people who are interviewed, though, are like, they're deeply sad about it, but they're like, well, but that's you gotta, kids got to be free to make their own choices. It's like in their mind, the kind of the freedom of their kids to keep their options open has to trump everything else, even though they recognize deep down that something utterly profound is being lost in the process.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that's worth reflecting on is this kind of inner conflict that these folks experience, because they really do at a certain level find it inescapable that they've lost out somehow. So I've got 6 grandchildren, 5 and 1 on the way, and every once in a while, I'm 62, so people who are my peers, fit into one of those two camps, either grandchildren or no grandchildren. And when I come across folks without grandchildren, I do detect sadness. And they might put a smile on their face and say my kids are doing great. They're have great careers or whatever, and vacation every year in Maui or whatever. But there's also this
it's always something like that.
Yeah, but there's always this palpable sense that you can just tell they feel like they've lost out on something really wonderful.
Yep. And I mean, and we think the euthanasia problem is bad now. Yeah. Fast forward 15, 20 years where all these grandchildless elderly folks are nearing the end of their lives. And I think you just have, massive demand for just like, I don't have any connection to anybody. Nobody cares about me. Right. Just let me out of here.
Yeah, it's going to be, and it's already sad. I want to explore something, though, that I think you've hinted at, and I'd like us to kind of bring it to the surface, though, and that is the fact that there's a implicit hierarchy to moral freedom. for example, when we think about the classical understanding of a human being, there's basically the head, the chest, and the nether regions or the abdomen, and it's understood that when a person stands upright, it reflects the proper order, coincidentally or by design, that the head should govern the chest and the abdomen, and that if a person is governed by their appetites, there's something seriously wrong with that person, and that person is a slave, in a sense, to their appetites. So there's a rebellion, even to this internal hierarchy that we should be observing as human beings, because we've elevated our appetites to a degree that our intellectual or life has to submit to it. That's what I run across a lot of times when I'm dealing with LGBTQ types. Very intelligent, but all of the intelligence, not always, but often, the intelligence is in the service of their appetites. They're
Right.
always trying to rationalize and justify and get everybody else to go along with them, because I actually just think that they know that there's this inner conflict that they're dealing with, and they can't. They need other people to support them, because if that doesn't happen, then they're not going to be happy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I mean, I lay that out in that chapter, drawing on the Platonic tradition and Aristotle. Very brief. It's all,
Yeah.
everything's very condensed in this book. But just kind of give a brief overview of how Plato and Aristotle talked about the rightly ordered soul. But, and then the Christian contribution there is to say that the problem is, it's like, the elements, that the faculties are out of whack, right? Because it's like essentially the fall has resulted in an atrophying of the rational faculty and a hypertrophy. I don't know how to pronounce it. Exaggeration of the appetites. So they're just much bigger and stronger than they ought to be, and they constantly take control. And no amount of philosophy or asceticism can ultimately fix that. It can make a difference. There's I'd much rather get a beer with Aristotle than Stalin.
Amen.
We could probably hang quite a lot with Plato as well.
But what Christianity says is, ultimately, you're going to be, in attempting to subdue the irrational appetites. What happens is you then rely more and more upon the chest to subdue the appetites, and then you become puffed up with pride, and you're still. It's just a nobler form of vice,
Right.
and so ultimately, the spiritual liberty of being set free from the burden of self-salvation and learning to rest upon the Spirit, to keep in step with the Spirit, as Paul says, is the prerequisite to growing into true moral freedom.
Yeah,
That's certainly a nice alternative to Diogenes, who's just kind of living in a barrel and casting aspersions at everybody that walks by.
It's interesting, because I think one of the problems, I think Christianity itself contributed to a lot of the problems with freedom, and we've talked about this enough, have been its own distortions or lopsided emphases on getting the balance between kind of intellect and will balanced.
Mm-hmm.
However you want to digest, like, the history of voluntarism, kind of run wild. Both, it's not just Protestants who have had issues with it. I mean, there's whole strands of different Thomisms and different types of Catholicism in the West as well. But I think one of the things that has placed a lot of evangelicals at a disadvantage is we're so far down the line where a certain kind of voluntarism or emphasis so much on the will, to almost to the point where the intellect, both with God and with ourselves, is so bombed out that there's no place for balancing the whole human being and addressing all the different dimensions of what needs purification, much less our intellect as well as the rest. And I think this oftentimes has lent itself into kind of secular variations, the kind of nihilism that we see today, where you have human beings that basically just see themselves as basically so autonomous that they're nothing more than a will that has no premise, and that they have this capacity basically to generate all meaning and self-determination and basically they write their own script all the way down. And yet all these things you're talking about are things they never can get away from. They can't get away from the fact that they do have a biological and creaturely history, that they do have all these relationships in their life that are determining both who they are and really the limits that they work in. And it does create a very strong delusion culturally. And I teach in the, a sort of secular philosophy departments, and students really still come in with this notion that they almost can transcend through their own choices and self-determination all kinds of things that are essential to our humanity, both intellect and will. And it's puzzling that this is still floating around, but it is good that you're doing this kind of work of correcting this imbalance, because I think a lot of times just talking about, my presuppositions versus yours misses the mark of addressing these deeper issues.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a valuable apologetic opportunity, because I think we're living at a point where that idea of, so the idea of freedom as the dominion of the will would mean, if that's true, then that would mean that the more and more options available to your will, the freer you are. And that's kind of the basis on which we've been operating for, arguably several centuries, at least the last century. But we're living at a point where we're living at the reductio ad absurdum of that, where we find that you reach this point of so many. It doesn't take long, really, to reach a point of so many options that the will is paralyzed. And so, the example I give, always when I talk on this in the book, I think our digital technologies really make this clear. We all had the experience of getting on Netflix and just scrolling mindlessly for 30 minutes trying to figure out what to watch, right? and that it was much easier when you just had 20 videos on the shelf.
Well, I remember 3 stations that you could watch and no videos.
Well, I like to think that growing up in the 90s was the golden mean, right? Just the right number of options. But and of course, so what happens there, right? What happens when the will is paralyzed by too many options? Well, as I said, it's not. Paul said it's not a question of whether you're going to be a slave; it's a question of what you're going to be a slave to. And what we've essentially said is, "Oh, almighty algorithm, free us from the bondage of our overload of choices." And so, Netflix is just here's what we think you want to watch, and we're like, okay, yes, right. And I think many young people are aware of the extent to which their supposed free choices have actually become just a means for tech companies to manipulate and nudge and exploit them. Yeah. And so I think it offers a good apologetic opportunity to say, hey, actually this whole voluntarist experiment doesn't work. That there's got some limitation of options further upstream is actually more conducive to freedom.
Yeah. Getting back to Berlin. Okay, go ahead, Glenn. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I'm, as I'm reflecting back on some of my experience with college students, I wonder how much of them even think of the will. I think for a lot of them, it backs up prior to the will to the level of desire. Yeah. Because they don't really. I think they're at a point. My impression was that they were at a point where they really didn't believe much in right or wrong or truth or anything else. And so ultimately the thing that determined where they went and what they did was, what is it that they wanted? And, ultimately, Augustine says your will is conditioned by your desires. Mm-hmm. But I think that in a lot of ways, the desires ended up being the 500-pound gorilla here. Mm-hmm. And much less than any conscious decision of this is an act of the will. Right. It's more like this is an act of desire.
Right.
Right. Yeah, it brings to mind Scott Peck. I don't know if you guys remember him.
Yeah.
The Road Less Traveled. He has something he talks about. He was a counselor, he was a psychiatrist, and he talked about, if I remember correctly, a woman who was essentially bound to her desires. And she said something to the effect, I can't stop doing this. And then he challenged her on that. And it came as a revelation to her that she didn't have to do what she wanted to do. And that was the beginning of the healing process for her, which was a fascinating thing to consider because it addresses just what you said there, Glenn, about everything kind of being reduced to the desires.
Right. So getting people to remember that they do in fact have a will maybe
That's
the first step. Yeah.
That's right. Right. Getting back to this idea of freedom for, because I think that's one of the things you're getting at here, and this is Isaiah Berlin and his positive freedom, thesis. There are a set of things that we'd love to be free to do, but we can't do because we don't have the discipline or the abilities. So no one wins a marathon by mistake. It's not like you walk down the street one day and find yourself in a big group of people running and you cross the finish line first. You have to be free to win a marathon. You have to diet, you have to train, you have to do a lot of things that are unpleasant in order to have that freedom to win. And I think that's something that's lost again on many people because we just think in terms of rights and desires as opposed to virtue and goals and freedom in that framework.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another way of thinking about it is I give the metaphor of a bowling alley. So, and this is a good way of thinking about the role of external versus internal constraints, of like law versus virtue, which is in the goal in bowling is knock down all the pins, right? And if you want to be free to knock down the pins, then you're going to have to figure out how to get the ball to go down the middle. Now, most of us starting out are terrible at doing that. And so you often with kids start out putting up the bumpers, which what they do is they turn your zigzagging motion into a rough approximation of a straight motion, right?
Right.
And I think that's how we can think of the role of law or what the equivalent in a household where a parent imposes boundaries, where you're zigzagging all over the place in your behavior, but the function of good law is to turn that zigzagging motion into a forward motion that actually achieves something like the human telos. But even better, if that happens, usually you're going to hit some pin, but you're still not going to bowl strikes very often, right? If you actually want to bowl strikes, then you actually have to develop the internal constraints where you're guiding. It's not after the ball leaves your hand; it's before the ball leaves your hand. All kinds of your muscles are being very, very carefully channeled and disciplined, so that it's going to go in a straight line. And so that's what virtue is those internal constraints that ensure movement toward the goal.
Yeah, I like that. Do you remember Bob Dylan's song, You Gotta Serve Somebody?
Yeah.
I don't know if
it
you're
may
a
be
Dylan
the devil
fan.
or it may be the Lord.
Yeah, he had this black choir that would come in on the refrain. You got to serve somebody. You might want to listen to that because essentially what he's getting at is what you're talking about here, particularly with regard to the Pauline understanding of freedom. You may serve the devil, you may serve the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. That was, I think, I think it still is a tremendously difficult thing for many people to reconcile themselves to. That even when you're just giving yourself over to your desires, you're actually making a choice for the devil or the Lord, and you're a slave to one or the other.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, and it is interesting. I mean, if you think of like the law language going on in Romans, especially when you're talking right right before you bump up into the language of the law of the liberty in Christ Jesus, right? I mean, Paul is, I see a law within me, right? And I do what I hate what I do. There's this tension, and then as he moves into doxology, this would be what you're talking about in your book about the Spirit's freedom, right? The law of the Spirit in Christ Jesus it starts with doxology. Thanks be to God in Christ, for in him there is no condemnation at all. And then he moves into this freedom that comes. And the freedom is not freedom from, it's not antinomianism, right? This is where I think a lot of times people get it wrong. And it's not legalism. It's actually the truthful enactment of what it means to be an image bearer as creaturely sharing in the very life of God. So that's what we're meant to be. And there is, as we enact our creatureliness, this transcendent way of living, even though it is completely creaturely and teleological and oriented towards what we're created to be and how we're to be perfected. And so what you get there is this invitation. I mean, Paul's very language is the glorious freedom of the children of God, right? What does it mean to base? I mean, you can kind of think of it when you look even at Jesus' invitation for us to pray, right? The very thing he does is he gives us the very orientation. When he teaches us to pray, we can now say, Our Father, right? We're positioned in our sharing in his sonship through the Spirit. And I just don't think we often tease out the radical implications for that this kind of bondage to Christ is the utmost freedom of what it means to be a creature. And I think a good analogy you mentioned earlier is music. I mean, one of the things you do with music is all the hard work of learning scales and patiently learning to move chord to chord and chord. And other than that rare gifted person, you can't just say, oh, I want to pick up an instrument and express myself. You can't. You just can't do it. I mean, I play guitar. You can the hours that go, but when you can almost get to where you can think of improvisation. You can move in and out of the patterns and forms and truly participate in your playing in ways that you could never do just by wanting to express yourself.
Yeah. This reminds me of, you were with us at the Touchstone Conference a couple of years ago, Brad, on the theme of authority.
Yep.
What's the book, Up with Authority?
Victor Austin. I think I quoted that in my talk.
Yeah. And
he uses the musical, the role of the conductor in an orchestra.
Yeah. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit for our listeners?
So and that's where you kind of get the, you can, the music analogy you can look at all these different dimensions, but one of those is that individual versus corporate, right? That, you've practiced really, really hard as a violinist and you've mastered the instrument and now you are free to play all kinds of melodies on it. You're still not free to perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Your only way you can have the freedom to perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is by getting together with a whole bunch of other people with different instruments and then learning the discipline to play along with them at exactly the right time, under the authority of the composer and the conductor, who, by guiding the individuals toward this common end, sets them free to do something that they wouldn't be able to do alone. So I love that analogy. Another one I use for maybe more resonant. Unfortunately, not many people nowadays go to Beethoven concerts, but everybody watches the college football, right?
Sure.
Like football is a great example remaining in our culture of the freeing role of authority, right? That, a football player cannot get on the field and say, I'm just going to go and run as hard and as fast as I can, and I'm going to make some amazing catches and amazing touchdowns, right? He has to submit to the play calling, and everybody has to do their job exactly right if the team as a whole is going to be free to win.
Yeah, I think one way too to even reconcile this reality with personal freedom is that within the constraints of your role on the team, you still have enough room for your own personal way of going about things to shine. So if we think about, say, baseball, and we think about, say, Willie Mays in the catch. So he's in center field. He is running away from the infield as hard as he can run to catch that hit that he catches over his shoulder, but he does it with such flair. And he loses his hat on purpose in the process. And everybody is just astonished at his athleticism, with his grace, but he was playing a role in a team sport.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't all about him. It was about his team at the same time. And I think sometimes the reason I bring this up is I think sometimes we think about this as sort of a win and lose scenario.
Right.
The team wins at my expense. No,
Right.
not really. The
Yeah.
team has provided an opportunity for you to shine and at the same time the team win.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. And I think what we can also say is, the other thing that we're missing so much today in our cultural imagination is just the idea of maturity, right? The idea that there are things that are good. Good things come to those who wait, and there's a kind of freedom that is appropriate for the child or for the novice, for the newbie on the team, and there's a kind of freedom that is appropriate to the adult, to the master, to the superstar, right? So like LeBron James and the new draftee both have to play their position and play their role on the team. But it is unquestionably the case that LeBron James has much greater freedom about how he wants to play that role.
That's right.
But that comes only with the process of growth to maturity. That you earn that ability by greater and greater internal self-discipline and mastery and excellence. You earn the ability to greater freedom of operation vis-a-vis others around you. Yeah. And it's like we all want to just sort of fast forward straight to that point of being the superstar who can, or even beyond it, because I say even the superstar can't actually just do what they want, except at the All-Star game, which is why nobody enjoys watching the All-Star game, because it's just 10 guys on a court showing off, right? It's not really basketball. But yeah, so we want to fast forward beyond all those phases of maturation through which we learn to exercise freedom.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think both on a kind of the Christian life in the church, but also kind of our created natures, there's kind of analogy there of the need for other types of endowments and gifts. In other words, my freedom doesn't have the capacity. I can't be perfected in the kind of endowments and gifts to enact them as free as I've been created to, without your giftedness, without Chris's giftedness, without Glenn's. And I do sometimes think we do, especially in a culture that likes to put the emphasis on ourselves, our talents, our self getting the glory. How much we do have to be interactive with and receive the good gifts of others to actually be that body of Christ, in that full freedom, but also to enact our regular gifts. Like you said, to be a guitarist in a band, that's a whole different thing than just sitting there. And even still, if I just a solo player, I still depend on the gifts of the luthier, the one who makes the fine machine, the audience to appreciate. I mean, you're connected to all these things that I think just as moderns, we have a very hard time realizing all these gifted determinations that actually are part of what push us towards perfection and enhanced our gifts.
Yeah, I was going to point out that when we look at the football game, we always think of the quarterbacks and the receivers and the running backs and so on, but in a lot of ways, how we just saw this in the college football playoffs, how successful a team is determined by the linemen.
Yep.
Do the offensive linemen or the defensive linemen control the line of scrimmage?
Mm-hmm.
That determines whether or not the backs can do what they're doing.
Right.
And I'm glad the commentators have gotten around to talking about the linemen, but they're not the people that everybody focuses on. They're more or less anonymous.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. I'd like to talk about a couple more things before we're done. One of those has to do with, say, cultural kind of propensities. So when I think about, say, the strengths of perhaps the Orient and the Occident, they seem to emphasize different things, generally speaking. So in the West, it seems as though the emphasis on innovation, expression, creativity creates an environment where things can come into being that are really fresh and new, but sometimes unpolished and lacking, I guess, the beauty of fine execution. But when I think about, say, the Orient, and I think particularly when I think about, say, Japanese timber framing or something like that, and you have something that's been refined and developed and perfected over many generations, and there's a right way to do it, and there's no tolerance for self-expression. In fact, there's a saying in Japan, it's the nail that sticks out that gets hammered. But that means that as a culture you're free, and as a tradition you're free in ways that, say, the more individualistic, expressive, say, Occidental way of approaching things isn't free. So there are trade-offs. Any thoughts on that, Brad?
Yeah, I think that's that's a really insightful way of putting it. And I think in many ways, what we've seen is in the West is for a long time, the steady expansion of that impulse of creativity and innovation and overcoming limits and uh, mastering nature seemed to pay off for us in a genuinely increasing experience of freedom and quality of life, uh, and just all kinds of measurable ways, like life expectancy and so on. But the problem is, and that sort of it made sense to focus on that when you're living in if your starting point is like Europe in 1500 and the average life expectancy is 30 and everybody's kind of bound to their lord's estate, and it's like when you're just fighting against the crushing necessities of nature plus these other crushing necessities of social order, then this impulse toward pushing the limit, innovating, as I said, mastering nature makes sense, right? But what Lewis says in The Abolition of Man is there comes some point of diminishing returns and then negative returns, where continuing to do that and continuing to operate with that mindset becomes utterly self-destructive. And the illustration I give in the book, following from him, he says there was a certain Irishman who discovered that a new kind of heating stove could reduce his fuel bill by half, and so he concluded that two such stoves would reduce his bill to nothing at all, right? And I think it's such a great metaphor for the way our culture thinks about all kinds of things. Like, hey, maybe let's like, women are too oppressed in marriage. Let's empower equality of the sexes. Okay, that went really well for a while. Okay, now let's kind of keep pushing that even further to deny any meaningful distinction between the sexes at all. Okay, or with, freedom of speech is a good area, right? Opening up more and more space for freedom of speech, great. At some point, it becomes an utter cacophony, and that drowns out the whole idea of freedom of speech was freedom of political speech to deliberate about the good and the true. And now we're just a cacophony that drowns out any voice that's actually trying to talk about the good or the true. And so I think, we have to recognize the real good and genius in the Western cultural heritage of innovation and creativity and technological fabrication. But we also have to understand, if we just run with that, then it will become self-defeating. And we're at the point where we need to learn from cultures like Eastern cultures that have, I think, probably, they embraced continuity to the point of, a vice, right? That you had these extremely static cultures that became very closed off and nothing changed for centuries. But somehow we need to be able to draw upon the best insights of that to temper our own.
Yeah, I joke about looking at Oriental art, particularly Chinese pottery or something, and centuries go by. I have no clue why this 18th century pot is any different from like the 11th century or like maybe 500 BC. You look at the West, and it's like one decade after the other, and it's like completely new world.
Well, and they make product for us like our image, where it falls apart with it.
Now, I guess a good way to wrap things up here is, can you give us maybe some thoughts on what you think the church, particularly here in the United States, needs to do in order to get back in touch with what you're trying to help us understand in your book?
Yeah, I actually think the local church has the most important role to play in resolving the problems that I identify in the book. I think, our political entities are so large, yes, we do still have mayors and town councils and so on, but the reality is so much of the actual political agency has moved to these huge federal bureaucracies that, I'm all like, get more involved in local politics, absolutely do that. But I understand people are sort of like, yeah, but that's not really where the action's happening. And where the action is happening is in a realm that's way too big for us to actually feel. We talked about, you can feel membership in a group as an expansion of your freedom. Yes, but only if the group is of a sort of enough of a size where you can actually feel like a meaningful part of it, rather than just, one out of 330 million, right? So if we're going to get back this concept of what it means to be free within as a member of a body, we need to say, okay, where do we have smaller bodies, and that are really important for our lives, and that's the local church. And I think the many American churches have gone just totally the wrong direction with this, where they've bought into this idea that, okay, freedom is good, and freedom means maximizing options. And so we need to give our people as many options as possible. We need to have an early service and a late service and a young people's service and a family service and a contemporary service, a traditional service, in-person service, a live stream service. And so, just, pick off the menu. And what it means is a fragmentation of the body into lots of, different groups that are fluid, and nobody actually knows who's a member of the church and who isn't. And nobody actually feels, therefore, nobody is sort of built up in the moral discipline of part of being stuck with the same group of people over a period of time is that you you fake it till you make it. You learn you learn not to behave in certain ways because you wouldn't want them to see you behave in that way. And then yes, that can just be an outward conformity that is just legalistic, and absolutely churches can become that way. But that pressure toward outward conformity isn't always a bad thing. And churches where you don't have this committed body of believers that see each other on a regular basis because everybody's tuning in to live stream church or whatever, are churches where it's a heck of a lot easier for the husband to be carrying on an affair and the kids to be smoking weed and whatever, and nobody knows anything about it. The pastor certainly doesn't know anything about it. And usually if somebody did know something about it early, detected that something was wrong and tried to address it, the response they would get is, well, that you're just being a legalist there. And so I think there's a new interest. Well, I don't know. Liturgical churches always like to say there's this new interest among young people today in liturgy. I don't know if they're just saying that to make themselves feel better, but there definitely is among. I think at least among some people there is a new interest in liturgical churches and celebrating the church calendar.
Yeah.
And some of that can be a kind of unhealthy, I think, just kind of like a retreat from modernity and trying to get back in touch with this sort of, we're sort of playing dress up, and it's like going to medieval times or something like that.
Yeah.
But
Renaissance fair.
Yes, but I think at its best, what it shows is that people are really hungry for this experience of a constrained liberty, of a corporate liberty, and of observing certain disciplines together so that they can grow in virtue. And so I think the more that churches can lean into that and say, no, we're actually, as a church, we are going to start practicing these. We're going to limit the options a bit more. We're going to have more structure. We're going to establish some corporate disciplines. And, I think the reformers were concerned about the way the medieval church had made certain like feast days and fast days matters of spiritual merit. And we need to beware of that. But they can absolutely, I think that's where the distinction of spiritual freedom and moral freedom is important. They're not means of gaining spiritual freedom, but they can be ways of growing into moral freedom. And I think our churches should be like, we're calling a day of fast, and we call upon, we don't command binding on conscience or whatever, but we call upon all members of the congregation to fast as you're able on this day, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's what I think we need more of. And I think if we can start to disciple our people in that, then it will help us have a better habits of thinking about freedom in all these other spheres.
Well, that's great. Yeah, that's a nice summary there, Brad. So is the book available yet? Is it
published last Wednesday. So
so it's out. So we encourage you out there in Pugcast land to check it out. Is there any place that you'd like them to go to purchase it, or is it just anywhere they can find it that's fine with you?
Right now I think Lifeway, the publisher, has it at like 20-30% off. So that's, you probably do a little better there than Amazon, but you probably get shipping faster to Amazon. So yeah.
Well, we'll put up some links, and we'll hopefully see a number of our people pick up a copy of the book. It's I think a really valuable contribution that you've made, and it's really, I think, a theme that just is perennially important to revisit again and again. So good stuff. Thanks a lot, Brad, for being with us.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
All right. And thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast, making it all the way to the end of this episode. If you like what you've heard and you'd like to support our work, just like everybody in the world, we have a Patreon page. And you can help us pay the bills that way. The three of us don't take any money from the show, but we do have people who do need to be paid who produce the show. So if you'd help out with those expenses, it would be appreciated. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.